I used to work part-time in a ski resort. I was in charge of the lifts, which entailed keeping an eye on customers. I had to stop the lifts if someone fell off or if the wind picked up. I was usually put in charge of the pair lifts at the very top of the mountain. The view from my station was extremely beautiful. You had a 360-degree panoramic view, and it was the most popular course in the resort. The skiers and snowboarders go down this gentle slope full of curves, leaving puffs of fresh powdered snow behind. If you come on a sunny day, it'll be an experience you won't soon forget. This course isn't for adrenaline junkies or for those who want something hard and complicated. It's more for leisure and sightseeing, so on the weekends it becomes very crowded. On weekdays, however, it's basically empty, and there can be days where I don't even have to step a foot outside from the station that's located right next to the ski lift. At this time, I was working with Masahiro, a guy in his 30s. He was a really outgoing and friendly guy, always telling jokes and making others laugh. He was using the employee dorms just like I was, so we would oftentimes have dinner together and have drinks well into the night. One day, there was a snowstorm, and sitting inside the station looking out, we could only see a white blurry haze. The visibility was really bad, so it obviously wasn't safe to ski, and the resort was basically empty. I remember the smell of kerosene from the heater and the whirring sound from the lifts as we watched them come into view, then disappear again. I noticed that Masahiro was looking a bit down. Maybe he was feeling depressed about having to work in this snowstorm, but he somehow looked more troubled than that. After a bit of uncomfortable silence, he spoke his first words. "Can I tell you something?" I knew it. I poured us another cup of coffee and sat and listened to what he had to say. He started telling me about what he experienced as a child. Apparently, he's from a place where it snows a lot in the winter. He was only about 4 or 5 at the time, and every time it snowed, he ran outside to play, building snowmen and igloos. On that particular day, it was already the 5th day or so of heavy snow, and he was tired of playing outside in the cold, so he stayed in the house, staying warm under the kotatsu. Both of his parents worked, so his grandparents who lived with them usually took care of Masahiro, but they were out that day. He vaguely remembers that the neighbors had invited them over. He didn't have anyone to play with and was bored, but he didn't want to go outside because it was snowing quite heavily. So he decided to just watch some telly. The show he was watching went into a commercial break when he felt something weird. He was just a young boy, so he couldn't understand what he was feeling, but it was a strange feeling. He felt like he'd seen this exact same scenario before. "You mean, like a déjà vu?" I asked. He nodded his head in response as he took a sip of his coffee. "I'm sure you've all experienced déjà vu before. The sensation that you've already been in the exact same place doing the exact same thing, but you don't have any actual memory of it. You just feel it. Some say it has something to do with the circuitry in your brain, and those who believe in the spiritual think that it's a memory from your past life. When it happens, some people just ignore it, while others try to dispel the feeling as quickly as possible. Masahiro was neither of those. He was actually enjoying this sensation because he felt like he could almost foresee the future. Just then, he heard loud knocks coming from the front door, and then the doorbell rang. He was home alone, so he had to go see who it was. When he got to the front door, he could see the shadow of someone through the clouded glass panel. He was still experiencing déjà vu up to this point. He suddenly felt uncomfortable as the déjà vu slowly faded, and he continued to look at the white shadow on the other side. The shadow was swaying from side to side. At first, he thought the person's hair was being blown around by the wind, but something was off. He couldn't quite pinpoint it, and considering he was only little, he did what he was taught to do by his parents and asked, "Who is it?" Maybe the shadow didn't hear the question or didn't care, but it asked a question of its own.
"Is Misaki there?"
The voice didn't sound male nor female, but it was a human voice. Masaharu cocked his head sideways and stood there for a few seconds, confused. Misaki wasn't his mother or grandmother's name. He was an only child and didn't have any sisters. It was a name he had never heard of before, so he replied, "There's no one here by that name." The shadow paused for a bit and asked,
Kosuke isn't there anymore.
Again, Masahiro had no idea who this person was. He was trying to decide how to answer when the shadow continued.
You isn't here anymore.
The wireless radio suddenly beeped and I jumped in my seat. Someone from the bottom of the mountain was trying to contact us to tell us that they'd closed the lifts for the day due to the bad weather and to put the lifts in the warehouse. They needed people for that, so I decided to head down the mountain. As I left the station, I turned around to wave to Masahiro, and I might be mistaken, but I thought I saw something white standing behind him. By the time we finished storing all the lifts away, I was exhausted. I finished getting changed, and as I made my way to the living area, I could hear a lot of commotion. Apparently, one of our co-workers got into an accident and was taken to the hospital. He was working on putting away the quad lifts when there was some kind of mistake and he got crushed between two lifts. No one actually witnessed it, but we all knew how heavy these lifts were. And with the power of the automated cables, it was clear to us that if a person got crushed between them, it would only have catastrophic consequences. In the midst of the panic, Masahiro quickly retired to his dorm room, his face pale. I quickly ran after him, asked if he was all right. He replied in a voice barely audible. His name. He didn't get to finish his story from earlier that day, so he said, "All the names that shadow said, they're all people who have died. Misaki was a girl in my year in elementary school. She transferred to another school, but she got into an accident and passed away. Kosuke, he was a co-worker of mine when I first started working. He got ill one day and he died due to it. The last name the shadow said, which was you. It was the only name I didn't know anything about. But the guy who just got into that accident today, his name is you." Neither him nor I could make sense of what was happening, but we could feel there was something strange at work here. Masahiro then added, "I can't remember much of what happened afterwards, but I remember what this shadow figure looked like." He didn't explain how he saw the shadow, but he continued to describe its appearance. Its outline was that of a person's, but its joints were all bent in different directions, almost as if someone took a doll and bent its limbs into impossible angles. His face was looking straight up and his jaw was ripped open, with the bottom jaw dangling above his chest. His upper jaw and the rest of his face was bent towards his back. Masahiro couldn't see its actual face, so he couldn't tell whether it was male or female, and he couldn't see anything apart from its jaws. From it, there were numerous finger-like appendages coming out and wriggling around like worms. It was so grotesque that he remembers it so clearly. As if this wasn't enough, this thing would suddenly move extremely fast and its limbs would pop back into that of a person standing normally, while its face remained unchanged. After a while, its arms and legs would snap and it would take an impossible form again. This happened over and over again, as if someone was fast-forwarding a videotape. All this movement is what made it look like it was swaying back and forth. The reason why he told me this story is because he remembered me telling him once that I liked scary stories and that maybe I'd be the only one who would believe his experience. After Masahiro got everything off his chest, we both agreed to not talk about it anymore, and we went back to our rooms. We continued working together, and Masahiro went back to his normal self until the ski season was over and our jobs ended. On our last day, when we were all celebrating the end of the season, he was the life of the party, telling his usual jokes and hyping everyone up. As the night was winding down, I saw him standing and staring out the window with a face frozen in fear. His eyes were bloodshot and I couldn't approach him because there was a part of me that didn't want to know what he was seeing. But he soon snapped out of it, turned to me and said, "I had a good time tonight. Good night." Before he walked off, I asked if there was something wrong. He replied in his quiet tone again, "Yeah, just had déjà vu again, That's all. I got goosebumps as soon as he said it, and Masahiro quickly went to his room, leaving me standing there. A few years later, there was a huge disaster at the ski resort and many people were killed. As soon as I heard about it on the news, I called Masahiro. He said, "That night, when I got back into my room, my déjà vu ended. Then I heard someone tapping on my window. I was too scared to move and stood still, but then I heard that same voice, and I saw that same shadow. It sounded as if the shadow was there to ask for someone again. It said,
Is Moa there?
The shadow continued to ask for several people. It didn't stop. Masahiro tried to look up the names that he could remember from this night, and they happened to coincide with the names of the people that were killed at the ski resort. What is this shadow being? I don't want to go searching for it, that's for sure. The last thing Masahiro said to me was, "This shadow always comes when there's a snowstorm." After I hung up the phone, I looked out the window and it was snowing heavily. I instinctively shut the curtains for fear that I might see something out there.